Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Thank you. I am not Stephen Smith. Let me first introduce myself. I'm John Duncan, and I will be introducing Stephen Smith. There we go. Stephen was born, raised, and educated in the UK, so we know he got a good education. And he's very... I can say that personally because I first met Stephen in 1999 when I first started working here. And I lived right across the meadow. And he would walk across, and we were hired to do proofreading of a little thing called the Collected Works, 17 volumes. And it was a two-person proofreading. And I was lucky enough that he did most of the reading in his dulcet tone of a British accent to me while I just followed along. And I think I learned most of what I know that was applicable to Krishnamurti's teaching in that time of reading all those books, plus a dozen others that we did together. Plus his command of the English language. He would stop and say, oh, you know, the past participle is da-da-da-da-da-da, and I would say, yes, you're right. I noticed that too. And then every now and then we would stop and talk about what we were actually reading, and that was very helpful too. And then also together we ran the retreats and the dialogues for many years. So Stephen is well versed in dialogue, and of course prior to that he was in Brockwood as teacher, teaching Italian and German. Oh, sorry, French and German. And still travels to and does dialogue there now. He lives in the UK now, and travels to India and works with education, educating the educator. He did put together this book. If you see it, it's a really comprehensive book on education. And I noticed a few chapters. It's not just about, you know, education and the classroom and this and that. There are chapters: emptiness, loneliness, sorrow, and death. Being alone with death. So again, very comprehensive in terms of, you wouldn't expect to find that in an education book. So, without further delay, Stephen Smith, Unravelling Conditioning, another look at life.
Thank you, John. Is that good? Yeah. Is that good? Yeah, okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Glad to see so many of you here. I don't know which is worse, a large empty hall or a small empty hall. But this is a nice full hall, so that's a good start. Well, as Krishnamurti said, I hope you haven't come to listen to a talk, but rather that you're in a mood for exploration, because this is what this is intended to be. And I hope as we go along it will raise questions in your mind, and we can talk about those later, and maybe at the end have a dialogue also. I will of course launch it because I've been thinking about this topic for some while, and I found it fascinating to work on myself, and I hope you'll find it equally fascinating to go into for yourselves. So, under context of the theme Unconditionally Free, Unravelling Conditioning, another look at life. I hope you won't mind if I read this, because I don't want to lose any of the points that I made. If, as we hear it for the first time in his speech of 3rd of August 1929, when he dissolved the Order of the Star in the East, Krishnamurti's stated aim was to set men totally, unconditionally free, we may well ask what has become of that aim. Pitched midway between two world wars, and pitched 90 years later on the brink of who knows what is its relevance to our lives today? We live in a time of moral upheaval, societal collapse, and environmental destruction. The myths and religions by which we have lived have lost their power to bring meaning to our lives, along with their power to coerce and control. We are lost in their absence, like figures in a fog. Was it ever thus? Or is there something unique about the times in which we live? That's a question in itself. This could easily lead to a debate or a discussion, but let us instead take the way of dialogue and hold both possibilities lightly while we examine them. In a talk given in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II, Krishnamurti says, "What has happened in the world after centuries of education? We have had two catastrophic wars which have almost destroyed man, that is, man as a means of knowledge. This is a clear reference to Homo sapiens, that is, the species as we know it. Homo sapiens means knowing human being. Have the two world wars really cleared the ground, meaning that we cannot go on as before? Or are we just living more of the same?" Again, I would suggest that we hold these questions lightly. Another 20 years, and we are in 1967, in what became known as the Summer of Love. Suddenly, everything seemed possible. Traditional values in every sphere of life, religious, familial, social, sexual, were brought under the microscope and found lacking. Hierarchical top-down structures, especially those invested in white male authority, lost their long-established place of power and began to seem arbitrary, functional at best. It was the decade, among other things, of the civil rights movement, where rights enshrined in the American Constitution were finally brought into focus and made real. And of course, the journey to the East, with its promise of enlightenment, or at least spiritual development, was the turning point of many young lives. The urge to break new ground was strong. But the world, with its power and its search for power, didn't so easily relax its grip. Hard reality, economic, political, and social, replaced the erstwhile flower power. War, as it always does, had taken its toll, and fear, as it always does, brought back the tried and trusted and tested, conservatism, and above all, the law of measure. I'll say some more about measure. The multiple experiments of the 1960s and 1970s, significantly in the field of education, tended, with some exceptions, to yield the field to the ever-increasing demand for testing. At age 7, age 11, age 15, etc., we needed to know how our children were faring. We needed point scores and grade averages. The taste for giving space to the unforeseen, the unexpected, which naturally cannot be measured, was brushed aside by this new demand. New not in the sense that it was original, but that the fear factor had regenerated it. Man is the measure of all things, said the Greeks. This too is something we have absorbed. We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of creation, and the vehicle of our supremacy is thought. The Greeks obviously did not invent thought, but they certainly brought it to a high pitch of perfection, including the notion of perfection itself. We Westerners have been bedeviled by this notion ever since. The point is, that the things we imbibe do not necessarily come from our immediate experience. They are inherited from the culture, even via the species. They operate unbeknownst to us in what may be termed the racial unconscious. They are hidden from us most of the time. This is why it is difficult to be free of them, and without persistent inquiry, impossible. The word conditioning, Latin cum dicere, meaning to say together, denotes not only the things we say, but the entire spectrum of inherited drives, aspirations, goals, and ideals, everything that human beings have thought of, invented, intimated, lived, and died for. It is the entire spectrum of what it means to be human, and the entire spectrum is in each and every one of us. This is what Kay means when he says, "You are the world." There is nothing local or parochial about this perspective. It is hardwired in the brain cells themselves. Measure, it seems, is endemic to our species. And along with measure come running its children, hierarchy, stratification, and authority, all of them enshrined in the house of knowledge. Knowledge begets them, and knowledge keeps them going. What I know becomes who I am, with all the attendant status and privilege and prestige, the priest, the professor, the scientist, the man of law. Power is invested in these positions, as it is in the more obvious power seeker, the politician. It is both an inner and an outer phenomenon. Initially absorbed through the socio-cultural matrix, including especially education, it is internalized as who we are, with the implicit equation that what we are is what we do. Comparison and competition are the norm. Not the healthy competition of felt and forest, but the falsely identified sense of self that is synonymous with our performance in the world. It stems from our sense of the mind as measure, and that measure is all we have in terms of meaning. Hence our addiction to point scores and grade averages. Hence also our tendency to look for meaning in a sphere far removed from our daily life, and to worship the hero, the saviour, the guru. Clearly then, competition and comparison are poisons in the glass of inward maturation. Instead of helping the young person to know himself, his thoughts, his feelings, his pangs of joy or sorrow, they project him from the inner into the outer, as if it were there that his true nature lay. There is the constant fear of not measuring up, of being judged inferior on the grounds of one's performance. Once the seed has been planted in early life, it spreads and grows everywhere, from the boardroom to the bedroom. We are rarely, if ever, free of anxiety. It seems woven in, as the existentialists maintain, with the warp and weft of life itself. And the proof of who we are lies in the actions that we take. There is no a priori self that acts. This is consonant with the teachings of Krishnamurti. Then there is the matter of identification, which again relates to the question, who am I? Living as we do in a fragmented state, we are naturally driven to seek the whole, W-H-O-L-E, and thus at some level, high or low, we form an attachment which binds and compels us. It may be to something greater than myself, a religion, a nation, a good cause, and to that I dedicate my life. I'm looking for something permanent and real, something that will stand against the tidal wave of life. The word implies that. The Latin idem means the same, so your identity has been always the same. In this unchanging entity, I invest myself. But this flies in the face of the obvious fact that life is change, It is constantly changing, and I am changing with it. This ongoing search for security, originating perhaps in membership of the tribe, forms the basis of my action. Banishment from the tribe was a fate worse than death, because I lose the total sense of who I am. Neither has this state of banishment disappeared from the modern psyche. Whether it is Heidegger's Geworfenheit, which is a German word, it means thrownness, that we are thrown into the world, or the horror of urban isolation, the sense persists that we are alienated from ourselves and have no real footing or ground to stand on. All is simulation, as one French philosopher puts it. But this simulation, strongly reinforced by the contemporary obsession with visual stimulation, can only, like the broom of the sorcerer's apprentice, produce further and finer versions of itself. It is a never-ending corridor, a hall of mirrors in a chaotic, crazy house. That we are in this crazy house, that we are this crazy house, is a first step along the road to self-discovery. We are schooled by society to become someone, not just in the sense of earning a living as a carpenter, a plumber, a lecturer, a teacher, but in the pernicious psychological sense of expanding our importance and gaining status. We divide ourselves along class lines as blue-collar or white-collar workers, and the amount of money we earn reflects this. Even in a fairly open, emancipated society such as this, a hidden hierarchy is in operation. This is what we mean when we say it is hardwired. It is hidden from us and it drives us willy-nilly. It is constantly telling us who we are, or at least what thought thinks we are. That we are not what thought thinks is a critical discovery. And though thought works in each one of us individually, it draws its strength from the fact that it operates universally. Kay uses the metaphor of a bucket of water that we draw from the stream and call it mine. But in reality, it has no separate existence. Therefore, it is to the stream that we should look if we would understand the totality of life. There is no separate individual salvation, whatever the various doctrines may proclaim. Your existence is my existence. And whatever the superficial differences of race, of class, of color, of culture, we all adhere to the same basic paradigm. We are of the same species. We are one. We also, incidentally, have the same DNA right across the board. It behoves us then, as in a good dialogue, to look at ourselves not as separate entities, but as inhering in the stream, in the current of common consciousness. Not only is this the right place to look, since looking wrongly one cannot see rightly, but it holds the key to a kind of strength in no way synonymous with intellectual firepower, but which contains within it the seed of intelligence. This intelligence, as Kay says, is neither yours nor mine. It is intelligence. That is to say, it is free of conditioning. It may at first be just a breath, an intimation, but with persistent inquiry, the seed bursts its shell. It grows as it must, organically. Unfortunately, for most of us, our personal lives and concerns are overriding. We do not look beyond the bucket. After all, it's the same water. The same but different, actually. For if I would really know myself, I must see for myself that what I call myself is born of the stream. It has its origins there. Though seemingly minor, even a quibble, this is a reversal of our normal way of thinking, which posits from the outset a thinker who then thinks. It is enshrined in the grammatical structure of our language, I think, where the I is the agent, the subject. But if the bucket is drawn from the stream, as it is, then it is in the stream that one must look for its origins, and not just its origins, most of its content. You are not an individual, says Kay, meaning that psyche is not whole. It is fragmented, broken up. It is part of the stream. This stream of consciousness contains our memories, the coloured shards of reminiscence, the things we hold dear and not so dear. In short, our images, including the self-image. These versions or reflections of reality actually control the way we behave. Not having direct access to the real, we invent, concoct, associate, devise, but always at one remove, through a glass darkly. We scene shift, but there is no actual change. This strikes at the core of what we mean by revolution, which is the state of being unconditionally free. While we are held by our images, and significantly the image of who we are, we cannot break the stranglehold of conditioning, which, let's not forget, is not ours alone. It is common to all humanity. To break the power of the image is crucial if we are to reach a different ground, hence this unravelling, hence this talk. We cannot break it historically, that is, by an analysis of its varied content. It takes an instantaneous act of perception, something that sees the whole field in a flash. For the field itself is the product of mentation. It has been built up in and through time. Therefore, time thought cannot undo it. It requires a different operation. Nor can what we are calling an act of perception be induced, anticipated, or in any way controlled. It has to come about naturally, and natural things have their own way of growing. What we can do is bring attention to bear on what is present to us in every living moment, globally, locally, universally, personally. There's a factor X in this equation, something forever unknowable. It is something like the new frontier, and we come upon it blindly, searching for clues. We have said that conditioning means saying with, cum dicere. In other words, it is contingent, and nothing that is contingent can bring release. It is like one wall of our prison talking to another, saying perhaps, "How nice you look," but electing to stay self-referential, not ready, not yet, to break the wall down. No action of will can break it down, since will is still part of conditioning. And conditioning itself is a long, slow process. It has been going on since the beginning of time. It stands to reason, then, that such a vast momentum cannot be halted by the means that built it, time. Time is not the instrument of release, as it is not and never was the means of revolution. All revolutions have foundered on that rock, be it the French Revolution or Communist Revolution or whatever. Something that cannot be said or said with, we must conclude, is unsayable. It is simultaneously unknowable and ineffable. We cannot apprehend it with our mind as it is. In other words, for the wall to come down, there has to be, at the same moment, a change in the nature of the perceiver. A change, as Kay puts it, in the brain cells themselves. The mind that's now looking is not the same mind. It has, in the act of observation, freed itself of its time-bound nature. It is an act of subtle alchemy, because the change in the subject, the observer, is at one and the same time a change in the object, the observed. The gap of time thought, be it never so small, is dissolved in the instantaneous act of insight, uniting the seer with the seen, and opening thereby the doors of perception. This is the cleansed state of which William Blake wrote. if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would be seen as it is, infinite. This is the cleansed state of which William Blake wrote, free to be present, free to look. It is free of the conditioned of the said with, free of the operation of time. This naturally puts it very briefly. One could, and perhaps should, go into it much more. But the point to bear in mind as this argument develops is that there are not two things, deconditioning and freedom, but that freedom from conditioning is freedom in itself. It is the state, the estate of being free. Nothing lies outside of it. Because the seeker has been united with the sought, and neither exists independent of the other, the things of time align themselves differently. Like death itself, they lose their sting. The fearsome dread of non-existence, which derives from our cultivation of becoming, falls away because we are in any case nothing. This nothing is not, however, the abyss or some pit of hell into which we are flung. On the contrary, it is the opening into emptiness, into an endlessly fecundating, timeless, boundless sea. The thing that we had opted into, the thing we say together, our conditioning, personal, social, conscious and unconscious, can now be seen as a continuous flow. At a deeper level, it also contains what Krishnamurti calls the sorrow of mankind. This more than personal suffering, which includes the sorrow of ignorance, exists because we do not know ourselves and therefore have no ground to stand on. The first task, in consequence, for any intelligent human being is to embark on the inquiry into her or himself. Only thus will we touch bottom with ourselves. Only thus will the river reach the sea. When once we see this, and that there is no alternative, no option, the very seeing generates an energy that drives us to begin, wherever we are. And that the situation is urgent, who will deny? By all accounts, there is not much time left. We have talked at some length about conditioning. Now let us look at the unravelling. Unravelling, obviously, is a process, like unravelling a ball of string. And the tangled knot of our conditioning calls for such an unravelling. We cannot, as Alexander the Great is said to have done, simply cut the Gordian knot and all our problems are over on the instant. That would be violence and could only lead to violence, to further conflict, unresolved loose ends. For the means we use determine the end that we reach. Violent means have violent ends. It behoves us then quietly, patiently, persistently to go into the knot and learn its secret hidden ways. The tool for this is observation. Observation not as a separate entity, the observer, but a kind of mute, extensive awareness in which this separating factor can be seen at its source as one continuous element in the wider field of consciousness. Seen thus, there is a subtle shift in the play of the different elements, since the observer, the controller, the thinker, the experiencer is no longer giving shape to what he sees. In fact, he becomes a quite neutral partner with no pre-selected emphasis. For the time being, his history is dead. It is this death of time which is crucial to observation, to what Krishnamurti calls observation without the observer. It is a necessary part of the unravelling, and it takes place when one is fully attentive. Full attention means that thought is in abeyance. We do not claim to have conquered thought. Indeed, the very notion is alien, but that thought in abeyance takes its proper place in the silent symphony of things. There was silence in the beginning, and there is silence now. there is silence when two people look at one another and see one another for the first time. Is there silence now? If so, we are observing. We are not going anywhere. We have come to where we are. And being where we are also who we are. Nothing is extraneous to our being in the world. This, however brief, is the insight that counts. It is an all-inclusive moment of perception. We are accustomed to think, because of our conditioning, that truth is additive, quantitative, needing measure. But actually, the reverse is the case. The truth may be, as Kay puts it, very small. We constantly miss it in our search for higher things, for greater, nobler things envisioned by the mind. In this constant displacement from our center of being, which is obviously the movement of comparison, we step down the truth, which is our core, in favor of something non-intrinsic, second-hand. This is why Kay calls us second-hand human beings. We have abrogated who we really are, or been trained, educated, conditioned out of it, and set our sail to a cruel crosswind, to a surface play of images. These, being reflections, can only depict. They are only a version of what is, like a portrait. Really, this involves a different kind of knowing, something inherent rather than acquired. It is the constant movement of knowing oneself, which is synonymous with learning about oneself. Clearly, it is non-accumulative. It is a different process altogether. One does not store up in order to use later, but the very seeing is the doing. Action is instantaneous, free of time. This doesn't mean one has to act immediately, which would again involve the tyranny of time, but that action arises seamlessly from the ground of perception and has its own intrinsic operation. It is free of time thought, and it is free of the ego. Freedom from the self is the true function of man, says Kay. This freedom is unconditioned and unconditional. This freedom is what we have come here to find. It is perhaps a conundrum or a paradox that what once has been unravelled needs unravelling again. Here we are on the forked tongue of time thought. It makes sense, as we said, to treat the whole thing as process, which necessarily has its own consequences. One of these is that a knot, once loosened, may rapidly attempt to reform itself. This is the case with most of us. The inheritance of the species, the culture, the race, takes on our colouring, our idiosyncratic twists and quirks. This masquerades as the personal self, and to this we give supreme importance. It is the felt sense of who we are. It is like the pig's tail we are forever trying to straighten. Inveterately, it returns to the coil. The hallmark of unravelling is constant application. It is an ongoing work of learning while living. Never is it after the fact. For it is in meeting the fact of our conditioning, personal, national, cultural, global, at the active interface of the moment that we are able to see and so dissolve it. Explanations, reflection, and analysis won't do, as these can only delineate the problem. What is required is a gathering of all our energy, an extensive awareness that includes both the person and the sum total of her or his conditioning, no longer as a conflicted field in which the one is trying to deal with the other, but as a bringing together of two apparent dissonances. This is possible because what manifests as two, the person in conflict with the conditioning, arises from a common ground, the common ground of consciousness. Traced back to their source, the two are not separate, they share a common genesis, not mere theory. This is actually so. This illustrates a further point, that the truth about ourselves cannot be disclosed at the surface level of the image and image making, which simply perpetuates and extends fragmentation, but that to go into something means to go down into something, to fathom its depths, to penetrate its core. This is a lifelong exercise. But the main point is that we are generated human beings, from the same word as Genesis. The human brain is very old, says Kay. Life did not begin with us, nor with people millennia ago. We have been going on for a very long time. This means that the strength of our conditioning resides in the general, in the common consciousness. It is only secondarily a personal affair. That this is not how it presents itself to us is one of the powers of conditioning, illusion. We are brought up, taught, and ultimately encouraged to think of ourselves as separate individuals, when, in fact, we are nothing of the sort. Even indeed to think that we are requires the common heritage of thought. So it's illogical even. Once established, however, the illusion is all-consuming. More and more evidence comes in to prove that it is real. And in the current hypervisual society, there is mutual reinforcement on every hand. We seem to be floating in an ocean of images, much like the plastic that clutters the seas. That both are man-made is no consolation. But whether we're talking images or plastic, it is clear that in their generator, humankind, lies the solution to the problem. Two other words that Krishnamurti used in that seminal speech of 1929 are total and absolute. These are synonymous with unconditional, but they have a different ring to them. The first implies that nothing is left out. The second, that it is completely independent. Both of them have corollaries and consequences. The unitive perception of which we have been speaking certainly means that nothing is left out. It is the vision of unity itself. The seer is enfolded in the seen, and the seen does not exist without the seer. Quantum physics has brought us thus far. As for the absolute, we'll go into it. As a concept, the absolute has several meanings, but we will sail close to the wind and choose the most relevant, that it means unconditioned and unconditional, completely independent, not relative or contingent, partaking of or being other. It is that which allows all things to be without being limited or influenced by them. Then how does it apply to our daily lives? It applies precisely because it is not relative. It has no qualification or equal. It has no door along the corridor of opposites, nor is it part of the hall of mirrors. In other words, it stands alone. Here we come across a vital link to one of the key features of the teachings, one oft repeated by Krishnamurti, particularly in the field of education. For while the communal focus is important, so also is the strength to stand alone. This is meant quite literally. Space and emphasis are given daily to the cultivation of observation in aloneness, without distraction or a goal to be reached, and similarly without the presence of other people. It is a first step, obviously, but an important one, since it helps cultivate a state of awareness in which non-activity is the basis and all oneness, all one, aloneness, the possible outcome. Again, we are in the arena of perception. Truth is a pathless land, said Krishnamurti, and this too is a feature of our freedom. It isn't something we shall reach in time or along the vast trajectory of many lives. It is waiting for us here and now. Not a matter of stepping forward, which puts us back in time. It is more like stepping sideways out of the known. It is negative rather than positive thinking. Skepticism, doubt rather than belief. The perceived direct fact rather than the story, the myth. Pathless also means without borders. It is an opening into the absolute. But careful, this is not a static absolute. It is not some ultimate endpoint like God. It is more like a standing invitation, a challenge even, to take to the road. As he himself puts it in a different context, arrival is death and travelling is eternal. We come then full circle to the place where we began, totally, absolutely, unconditionally free. There is no greater freedom than this. We are now only 10 years away from the 100th anniversary of that groundbreaking statement, a shattering for our established view of things as were relativity and quantum theory. And just as these theories have reshaped our world externally, introducing an entirely new perspective, so the possibilities I have touched on in this paper can rework the psyche and make it new. But there is a challenge. We must engage with it. We must read it, play with it, absorb it, test it out. Only thus will it reveal its riches. Pathless does not mean directionless. There is richness, stability, and great strength here, the enormous gravitas of a canyon boulder. Its unfolding, much like the unravelling of conditioning, of which it is actually the coin's other side, with which it moves as in a dance, comes about naturally with every step of inquiry. The dispelling of illusion reveals things as they are, and seeing things as they are brings refreshment and joy. Let us walk this road to the very end. Thank you. So, sit down for a minute. If you have questions, you can raise them. Or... Yeah.
What does he mean by second-hand man?
Second-hand human being?
Yes.
I think what he meant was we get all ideas from other people, or we get them from the media, the newspapers, you know, it's sort of, it's not an original expression, or we borrowed it from somewhere, we picked it up somewhere, which is, I think, that's part of what conditioning is, that we've had all these things kind of put into us, and therefore after that we are in a way automatic, actually. Yeah.
Do you think Kay is saying that we can end conditioning, or that we're stuck with conditioning but we have a way to deal with its effects?
No, I think he's saying we can get rid of it. I mean, unconditionally free means that it's yeah, I think so. But it's a journey, you know, it's a journey. Jürgen?
Yeah, I mean, you've said
many things. And I would like to bring it home a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And beginning, you ask that question, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Which is in a way a question everyone has. And a lot of our lives turns around that question, who am I? Not only in the, let's say, in the social field, who I am in regard to others,
Right.
but also existentially,
Right.
what am I? And if one asks that question and goes into the inquiry, one might find oneself thinking, and one says, okay, thinking is just too limited to really bring me to that ground. So then one maybe discards that and goes into perception, trying to perceive. You question and try to perceive where the question leads to. But also there you find that your perception is full of assumptions, is full of... That actually was a very beautiful line by William Blake.
Right.
The doors of perception are not cleansed.
No, they're not, no.
They are not.
No, that's the clogging. I think
Yeah.
conditioning is a kind of clogging, actually. It's like something in the dream. No.
So one would have to continue to see the impediments,
Yeah.
the assumptions in one's perception. And one might reach then something, but this is important for me because if there is no assumption, if there is no pre-structuring, if there is no refuge to knowledge, then perception becomes something unknown.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as dire as that, because after all, we use thought as the instrument to get going. You know, we all read Kay, and so thought is an instrument. It sort of gets you, I look at it, it gets you going, or at least it points you in the right direction. It's not the direction, but it's a map of the direction. So then you have to walk it. And that walking is existential, use that word. That walking is existential. It's not just your thought process that's involved, it's the whole of your being that's involved. That, sooner or later, you must come. If you ask the question, who am I? Sooner or later, you must come to the realization that involves the whole of yourself, the whole of your life. And that it's an uncharted sea, basically.
So you actually, yes, you come to the unknown.
Yeah.
You don't see another object. You
No,
don't know.
No.
Yes.
It's somewhere between the object and the subject. I think this is why Kay spent so much time talking about perception and the observer is the observer, the thinker is the thought. You know, it's repeated endlessly throughout the teachings, actually.
Yeah.
Because that seems to me a sort of gateway perception. It opens up something, but in general, people are stuck, you know, way before that gateway.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is a sort of necessary point of entry. At least I regard it that way. It's a necessary point of entry.
Yeah, when you hear the saying, truth is a pathless land, it can be taken in the one sense, the path being organized religions like Theosophy or Christianity or Hinduism or whatever.
Right.
Or it could be taken in a sense more broadly of any kind of path to the truth. And I was wondering, like when you think of the Noble Eightfold Path of the Buddha, I know Professor Krishna dismisses that as being a construction of Buddhists after the Buddha died. I don't know if that's the case since that's so central to Buddhism, but would, you know, there's some of the elements on the path, you know, like right meditation or right, I don't know, sometimes called views. I don't know if
Yeah,
you get
right
so much into the
language,
right speech
yeah.
and sort of getting into ethics a bit more than Kay does, but would, you know, as you might, you know, like the Heidegger, you have path, vague, and Ishbeka, and so forth, and the path, and the word, you know, for Plato, you have the methodos to untos, the being on the way to being, which, you know, method contains the word path.
Right.
would path, like in this sense, like say what the Buddha has with, you know, right meditation and all of that, and which includes basically the, you know, the four things, and seeing what suffering is, or however you want to call it, I guess broader than suffering, I guess, and here's the removing of that, and here's the way to the removing of this. Would that be totally to be eschewed, do you think, or do you think path in some sense can be embraced? That if
I
one
don't
doesn't
think,
take it like in the sense of organized
did you
religion?
see the presentation yesterday of Michael Mendiza?
Yes.
That Indian lady who said, she put it very succinctly, I thought, but it's commonly thought in India and elsewhere that the Buddha brought rationality to spirituality. In other words, there are these steps and stages. Krishnamurti goes beyond, so you know, we may have our own takes on that, but I think he starts where the Buddha ends in a way. I think she said that actually. He starts where the Buddha ends because he sort of leaves all that, or almost takes it for granted. You may not be able to take it for granted, but the push is for something else. It's like breaking new ground in a way. So you don't go through a lengthy... It's not necessary to go through a lengthy process. On the other hand, it is necessary to dissolve conditioning. So dissolving conditioning becomes not a path exactly, but it becomes a moment by moment learning about oneself. So he puts you in that position. So there are no steps and stages really, but there is a penetration of what is actually now. And that he elaborates and describes. And Wally?
I was just thinking with this whole thing about paths. It seems to me that we seem to have this quest for an affirmation of what we're doing. That somehow I want to know, this creeping sense of wanting to know, am I on the right, you know, am I doing something right, or am I doing something? There's a sort of way in which I feel that there's almost like an inbuilt movement to want to have some form of things that, even if am I hearing Krishna Ji correctly, I'm just, you know, that am I okay? And it's, to me that's quite an interesting moment, because actually it's this aspect again of the sense of knowledge arising, it seems to me, I mean, this is, that's constantly trying, and then it sort of moves you away from actually the noticing of what happened. So I think this is for me it's very interesting about where that goes in one's brain, about what a path is, and am I okay, am I not okay? Yeah. You know, have I got condition? It gets into another little spin, it seems to me. Should I be on the Buddhist path? Yeah. Anyway, I'm just, it's not a question, I have to say, it's rather an observation and a participation.
No, well, I think it's true that people tend to need a reassurance, so they want some reassurance, like a child, you know, is he behaving properly? And Kay did think humankind was immature, and so did Freud, actually. So you know, there are some formidable thinkers out there who have thought that humankind, Nietzsche also, the human being is a monkey, you know, he has to go through the next stage. So several other people than Kay have made this kind of statement, that the human being is not fully developed. He's in a sort of inchoate state, you know, evolved, physically particularly, has survived, but is now in danger of destroying himself and the planet with him. So, you know, people have said this, that there needs to be a maturation process in the core of the being, you know, not intellectually, not emotionally, but something else. There seems to be another element that's required, and perhaps the challenge that is facing us now is such that this element it must be found. You know, it brings an urgency to it that maybe wasn't there before, in spite of 2 world wars. Yeah.
Do you think that the problems of dealing with conditioning that we face that we have faced since Krishnamurti passed on, are somehow changed the game. And what I'm thinking of specifically here is technology, social net, Facebook, Google, and so forth. Do you think that that is a game changer and requires an adaptation of Krishnamurti's teaching? Do you think, or do you think otherwise?
No, I think the teaching are the teachings. They stand as they are, and I think it was Wynton Marsalis said, if you want to understand Beethoven, you have to go to him. He's not going to come to you. So I think in a sense we have to go to the teachings. You can't step down the teachings and say, oh, if I do it via, there's a better way of doing it. I don't think there's a better way of doing it. I don't have more than I need involvement with this, this current wave of interchange, communication. But people who do and who are concerned with it, like Fran Ferraz, who was talking yesterday afternoon, they seem fairly pessimistic about it, actually, that it's not contributing, and very often it's distracting with an increase of superficiality, narcissism, self-regard.
Can I give you a silly counterexample? Because I attended that. I was thinking afterwards that I really do think that we could be using modern technology as a tool to help us deal with conditioning. Here's a silly example, but it's personal. So most days I drive from my house to where I walk in Dana Point. And there's one road that connects point A with point B. And for, I don't know how many times, I just mindlessly got in my car, went right south on Golden Lantern. Well, one day, I put on Google Maps and I noticed that it had, in blue, straight shot, but it showed two alternatives in gray.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. And it said same ETA, same estimated time of arrival.
Right.
I said, why don't I change that?
Yeah.
So I tried each of those routes, and by God, I saw new parts of Orange County that I haven't seen for years. And I thought, what's really going on there is that I had been conditioned to take the straight shot, and technology opened up some new paths for me. So I'm not sure it's fair to generalize from that particular point, but at least for me, that indicates that there might be circumstances where technology could be a real help in awakening intelligence and breaking the knot of conditioning, the things that Kay was talking about. Do you think I'm all wet there, or do you think that there's something to it?
No, I think there's offer. We also drive using Google, and Wendy's quite good with it, actually, which leaves me out of the loop. But no, I mean, if you just look at the work of this foundation, the other foundations, they're going at it pretty strongly to get things out there. The Free to the World program that's been generated at Brockwood puts the entire body of Krishnamurti's work online. It's available to anybody free of charge. So that is, I think we shouldn't confuse the means of dissemination with the actual content of the teachings. The content of the teachings, it's a means of putting out what is being said, but it's not. You can't alter what's said. I don't think that's not the name of the game. Again, I think you have to go to the teaching. You can encourage. You can have gatherings like this. You can have speakers here and there. You can do all kinds of things, but you cannot step down the truth. I mean, that's that. Yeah.
I mean, to go to the teachings cannot be an outward movement, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about becoming unconditionally free, we are talking about the innermost in. We are talking about observer and observed. So we're talking not about anything which would be in any way out there, nor maybe really in there. It would be on another level. It would be more direct than direct. It would not have, as he said, it would not be more knowledge, it would not be more technique.
No.
It would be something very, very, very immediate.
No, I think the demand is the same. I mean, I think this demand of the religious, if you want to put it in a much broader context, the demand of the religious has always been there, and it's always been demanding. You know, people have known that. So relatively few people are interested in Krishnamurti's teachings, quite frankly. It's too difficult. But, you know, it is there, and it's shining, as it were. So, any other questions over here? John? Go ahead.
I actually wanted to build on your statement a little bit, go a little bit further, higher up. I just want to state the presumption of this question is that humanity is fully a product of nature. Could it be said that if humanity is fully a part of nature, that part of the long arc of our existence, conditioning, and Krishnamurti and other teachers have said we are a little bit, young as far as the species goes, could it be said that conditioning is part of our natural process, and that maybe it should not be undone? Because it's going, in the long arc of history, it's going to lead to something else, including the war, including the destruction.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, this touches on a very big problem, actually, in the sense that I didn't really go into in my talk, which is that there has been this biological evolution. We have survived and we've developed things. But there's also been the development of what you can call consciousness. Now that consciousness is not solely preoccupied with survival, but it has other needs and wants and desires which are in excess of the biological status. So we have nationalities, we have, we have ways in which we form an identity, we have a sense of insecurity. So therefore we band together in certain groups to defend ourselves. So there are ways in which our psychological identification, and particularly the identification with the self as the center of not just my world but the world, this seems to be a destructive element. So all those things have happened, but they're not. I don't think they're neutral, like throwing plastic in the sea when it was, plastics have actually not been around for all that long, 60 or 70 years. But now there's an area as big as a country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean somewhere that's full of plastic. So we have generated a supernumerary level which is difficult, dangerous, and confused. So I think that, that my task in giving this talk, and indeed the gathering, is to get some clarity about that confused state so that we live a more meaningful life, basically. John?
I think you mentioned that when thought is in abeyance, perception can occur. But it seems then like a paradox that sometimes what is perceived is the movement of thought. How can that be if thought has to be in abeyance for perception to?
Oh, right. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Or fragment of it, maybe. Freedom from the self, not freedom from thought, per se.
Yeah, freedom. I see it more as a space that opens up. And it may be a simple perceptual observation, like looking at a tree or hearing a bird. It's a space that opens up in which things are seen as they are. And it probably doesn't matter all that much whether it's a thought or a stream or a bird, but you're seeing it as it is. The power of illusion is so strong in human beings that we're constantly being fooled by our own mechanism, by our own thought mechanism, into thinking things are other than they are. This is a huge trap. So I think the purpose of inquiry and indeed all meditation is to see things as they actually are, and to see oneself as one actually is. That's a terrific challenge, you know. It's in general much easier for other people to see us as we are than for us to see ourselves as we are. That's interesting. Yeah. Oh, Gopal, you had a question.
So much specifically a question for you, just to share, just listening to what you read out, I had the sense of sort of being on a journey in a vast, expansive landscape, you know, when you spoke of it in terms of consciousness. And so my experience was, and I don't know how many who shared that experience, of sort of being oriented at some points, disoriented at other points, right? But vast landscape nonetheless. And so when looking at it, not just in terms of a personal land or just in terms of a personal journey, when you've raised it in the sense of consciousness of all of humankind, and taking us back full circle, as you put it, I think there's a lot that we do to try to even reduce this so-called here and now. You know, I mean, it's also related to what Wendy brought up, the sense of we want to try and find out, am I doing things right? Am I locating myself correctly in this landscape? So just, I'd just like to raise it as a question. It came to my mind. It might seem clever, or maybe it is clever, but the question is this. So when is now and where is here? That's sort of the question.
Rhetorical question.
I think it's in the 70s or 60s.
Yeah. Anybody? Ken, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Yeah, there's three birds here that got all the questions. Anybody out there? Yes, sir.
What do we really need to do to go beyond it all? I mean, like, you know, we've been doing all this stuff with, you know, the teachings and stuff, but, you know, none of us really go past that border or that bridge or that chasm. We're all caught here and saying, oh, we want to be there, we want to be here, we want to be somewhere else, but at the end, we're still prisoners.
Yeah, I admit it can be or seem frustrating. That's why I lay quite a bit of emphasis on persistence. You know, persistent inquiry. I think what is just as the nature of who I am is hidden from my view normally. So any work that one is doing at a different level, the fruits of it may not be obvious. So I think it takes a certain attitude of mind, a certain resolution, a certain earnestness, seriousness, and to stick at it. I don't think it's not a quick result. It's not a quick results operation. Anybody who's been involved in this for some time would tell you that it's not a place for quick results, because you are actually working with the unknown, and the unknown by definition you don't know, and you don't know actually what it's doing either. But you can be open to it, and above all you can ask questions, right questions. Yeah.
Maybe more a rhetorical question, but I noticed this contradiction of there being no separate individual salvation, and this inquiry kind of having to be maybe a personal inward process. And so trying to understand how collectively we can experience salvation, or whether that's possible.
Yeah, I put quite a lot of emphasis on common consciousness as being the source. So there are ways in which you can participate in common consciousness. One of them is dialogue. And there's been quite a lot of dialogue this weekend, actually, you know, different people holding dialogues. So that is one medium by which you can get into this and get the sense of the shared consciousness, because, you know, in a talk it's delivered. But if you're in a dialogue, a good dialogue, a dialogue that's working, you will get the sense that it's a shared consciousness. And in that forum, it's not so important who says what, but what is articulated is important, and that everybody listens to it and looks at it together. Now, in that operation, there's a transformational quality. But it's not to do with individual salvation. I mean, there are many ways in which Krishnamurti is radically different from other teachers. And an individual salvation is one thing that has actually been drilled into us by the culture. You know, we have to save our souls. And that it's an individual exercise. Not that you don't have to do things individually. It doesn't mean that. But where does it lie? It's a bit like the question, where is here? Yeah, it's here. But I think looking in the right place is extremely important, and looking in the pool of consciousness or the stream of consciousness. I stressed it as the place to look, because I really do feel, having worked with this for over 20 years, that's where the fact of the matter lies. You know, I have obviously my own idiosyncrasies and quirks and temperament and whatnot, but the actual source of it is somewhere else. And if you're looking in the wrong place, there's a wonderful Sufi story about a king who had a beautiful daughter, and this beautiful daughter was offered in marriage to whoever should come along and propose to her. But there was a test, and the test was to retrieve a vase from the water, from a pool. And successively different men came along and dived in the pool, and they failed, and they were executed for their failure. And then one young man sort of said, well, I'm not going to get executed. So he consulted a wise man, and the wise man said, but the real vase is not in the pool, it's in the tree. So he climbed the tree and got the vase. And won the hand of the beautiful daughter. So in a sense, our consciousness works on reflections. Images are reflections. You know, if you look even in caves 20,000 years old, like there are in the south of France, they are depictions of reality. They are not the reality itself. And I think it's a good thread to hang on to, that these images are not, they are reflections. It's a reflecting consciousness that we have. And that is, you know, that is of course part of the difficulty or part of the complication. It's quite fun too also, but you know, you can't pile on so many reflected images that you can't see the fact. You can't see what is, which may actually be very simple. Yes, sir.
In the Truth is a Pathless Land talk given by Krishnamurti, he talks about harmony between reason and love.
Reason and love.
And
yeah.
I just wondering if when he says unconditionally free, is he talking about completely removing the conditioning, or coming to some harmony between conditioning and love or living?
Well, I don't see how a partial something that is partial cannot embrace the whole, as I see it. So as we are conditioned, and part of that conditioning is fragmentation and reflection and seeing things partially, there has to be some process that we engage in which dissolves that partiality. And then I think reason, harmony, love, they're all there, actually. We don't have to invent them. But I think it works that way round. It works negatively. Sri Krishnamurti put a lot of emphasis on negative thinking and via negativa. You know, you say what things are not. You don't believe, you question belief. You don't give answers, you ask questions. You know, this is a constant way in which he approaches things. He doesn't actually give you answers. He doesn't, although he founded schools, he never delivered a pedagogy, for instance. He said it was up to you to find out, and people are doing that right now. So it's not something that supplies answers, because we've been fed on answers for so long. We've had so many answers, but we haven't asked the real questions, or very few. But people are beginning to do that, because you know, we're in that state we're at. Yes, sir.
So with the works of Krishnamurti, is it to move toward, in a practical viewpoint, to move toward living unconditionally? Is it about the questioning, or the examination, or the inquiry as us as humans, as a person, that will assist or help us move toward becoming unprogrammed the way information is fed to us in society?
Right.
I'm just trying to see where the practicality is the step 1, step 2, step 3, what things that we need to, I guess, focus on or be concerned with to get to the truth, the pathless land toward truth.
Yeah, I don't think there are steps, actually. That's one of the things that distinguishes Krishnamurti from other teachers, and it's also one of the things that makes him quite difficult for people, is that there are no steps, but there are questions. There are very real questions. You know, who am I is a very real question. What am I? And the question of, if I know, do I really know this? You know, I may think I know it. Do I really know it? So self-questioning, self-doubt is quite a potent tool, actually. So that's one of the things. I mean, you're not left without anything to do anything with. It's not that. But it is rather a via negativa. You don't assert things. You say that I believe, like in the Christian church, you assert every Sunday, I believe in God the Father Almighty, Maker of heaven and earth. You assert that. It's an assertion, and also in Judaism you assert. So in Islam you assert things, but with Krishnamurti you do not assert. You ask. You question, and that also is. That is quite a potent tool, because then the thing that once you start with a conclusion, with something very firmly held, it's very difficult to break it, because, you believe it, and it becomes an anchor also. It becomes a security for you. Where will I be without that? If I suddenly lose my faith, where will I be? Well, actually, you might be quite liberated. And that's happened to numerous people who, are in this ambit, that they have broken out of a very strong conditioning, and actually the feeling is one of relief and release. So they move on from that point. So there is such a thing as inward freedom, even at a relative level.
It's interesting you said that, because what comes to mind from reading the Think on These Things,
right.
Krishnamurti indicated in there that as soon as you believe in anything, the mind begins to fall asleep.
Yes.
questions.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, you can watch that because it becomes automatic. You just do things, you know, because you do them at 6 o'clock, you know, and you do it at 6 o'clock. So.
But in that way, but the situation is already that I believe in 1,000 things. But I'm full of assumptions. I'm full of what I think reality is, what I am, what perception is. So I'm not in any way empty. I'm full of things which I don't even know that they drive me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why it's a long journey for most people. Because you discover different levels and layers of this conditioning. That, oh God, you know, you sort of stumble. You often stumble upon it, you know. So, but nevertheless, there it is. It's like, you know, it's like taking a walk. You might trip over something. Yeah. Yes, sir.
One comment, you mentioned earlier, it's not something there. The reality, the truth is here. The problem is we have conditioning, things that obscure it, that cover it. So we should look at what causes us to our conditioning is what we believe in, and those are the things that we need to negate, observe. And if we see them, how it's operating individually on each one of us, we may see what actually is here. It's not something there. It's all here, but it's obscured by our conditioning. That's what we should negate and look at what the process that we automatically come from the past, from what we learned, that really obscure what is reality over here, what melting.
Yeah, that's true. But it's not just personal or part of my personal story, which we actually reinvent every day when we wake. You know, we reinvent and opt into that. So there's my personal story, there's my family story, there's my local history, but there is also the racial unconscious. There are things working in us which we have never thought of, probably, but they're working nevertheless. So you get surprises along along the path of inquiry. You know, oh God, I didn't know I felt that, you know. So there are surprises. But they're interesting too. Francisco?
Yes, I have a question from the YouTube streaming live. Somebody called Dean is asking, what is the observer or experiencer who is aware of conditioning?
Can you repeat it?
What is the observer or experiencer that is aware of conditioning?
Right. Well, the observer or the experiencer is the static entity, or feels that it's the static entity, the fixed entity that is doing things. I think I mentioned it's enshrined in the language. Shall we say, he thinks, I think, you know, so our language reasserts it also. So we reassert this sense of there being someone there who is experiencing something, and indeed that the experience often derives from them. So they are the originator, whereas in fact they are the consequence of the experience. So the experience creates the experiencer, and by embodying that experience, repeating it to oneself maybe, or writing about it or whatever, you strengthen the sense of there being a person here who is experiencing the world. The crucial question, if I could resume the whole thing in 2 minutes, the crucial question is to ask, is that person real, or is there a person there? Or is it simply the operation of thought as a mechanism which expresses itself universally in every human being, wherever they're from, at whatever level of culture, whatever. Or is it that process that's repeating itself because it's programmed? And that is one of the things Krishnamurti said that is something of a shock in a way, because we don't like to think of ourselves as being mechanical. We don't like to, oh yeah, I'm... But it may purely be a mechanical operation. It's coming out in a particular form in this person over here, but actually the basis of it is mechanical and universal. So that's the experiencer. But it's an operation of delusion to take out one particular experience and around that construct a world, which you then say is me. This is the crux of the illusion, really, and we do it repeatedly also. Shall we adjourn? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. No, I didn't sit in it for very long. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Shelf Road. Shelf Road. Yeah, like a shelf, yeah, like a bookshelf, yeah, yeah. Shelf Road, yeah, yeah.